How marvelous would have been to have late works by Schubert, Chopin, Mozart, Weber, and so many others who died, unfortunately, too early for us who cherish and rejuvenate our own lives every time we have companionship with their pieces, projecting how they would have evolved in terms of style, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of, in fact, always surprising us, likely. And when we have a chance to hear late works by Brahms, like the Intermezzi, had he died in his late 30s, as some of these unfortunate deaths happened for these other composers, we would have never known the intimacy of his piano writing compared to the Herculean symphonism of his piano, let's say, sonatas when he was younger. Imagine what would have been Chopin after the Barcarolle, what would have been his third and fourth concerto, with this elegant chromaticism, with this sophisticated subtlety of innuendos in the inner voices, besides the unforgettable melodic line, which is his signature anyway. Or what would have been something to compare Beethoven and Schubert in terms of stylistic kinship. They say Beethoven never met Schubert in that famous Viennese city where Haydn and Mozart were like in a sort of a artistic and most likely aesthetic filiation. Whenever Beethoven, early after his Haydn period of, let's say, sonatas writing, he broke the mold. He went rogue, the audacities of which today are hardly comparable to the music as it went beyond atonalism and serialism in the 20th century. But at the time, for its time, the audacities of his tonal choices, of his dissonances, of his choices of slow movements and fast movements compared to the formal that was expected. And that is really fantastic, because when you play the Schubert Sonata in major, do, re, mi, re, do, si, do, mi, and you play the second movement, opus 90 of Beethoven's Sonata, sol, la, si, mi, fa, sol, si, la, sol, fa, sol, la, do, si, fa, sol. You almost feel like it could have been mostly like Beethoven having heard Schubert, when, of course, Schubert heard a lot of Beethoven, his role model, the giant in the place, the most famous composer of his time while alive, in Vienna. So when you hear a C minor dramatic tonality that is so specific to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony or Pathétique Sonata, or even the last sonata, opus 111, and the same expression of dramaticism that comes already with Mozart's C minor sonata K457 towards the end of his own life. Who is ahead and who is behind, looking to the past as an inspiration? That clearly is Brahms for Beethoven. The reviewers even mentioned, after the premiere of the First Symphony by Brahms later in this incredibly rich 19th century there, that it is Beethoven's 10th. So much, yes, he was looking in the back rather than the front. But all these facts are very simplistic, and in fact, this chronological analysis of organizing structures to place these composers as if they belong specifically in a time, in fact, somewhere ahead, somewhere behind, what does it matter? when we listen to them, when we play them, when they move us or they amaze us or they contribute to our culture and our being, I think it doesn't matter when they were written. Of course, as a scholar, as a student, as a musician, as a musicologist, you analyze these situations in terms of chronology. But I find that very striking because when we try in academia to organize the order of the composers in terms of Baroque into classical, into still galant, into romanticism, into modernism, I think none of these composers fits exactly in the boxes that we try to place them in for our organized study review. And that is what I like the most about it, is that when they have to say something from their inner themselves, they say it, and whatever means they need, they find. But they don't use a mean just to promote that they are this or that in terms of the language or the aesthetics or the modernity versus the non-modernity, if that was the word. Schubert dies 1 year after Beethoven, of course, at least 20-some years younger. And sometimes when you hear his music, while you feel this Mozart, Beethoven influence through his own compositions, claiming as he was that he was self-taught, except obviously by example, directly, of Beethoven and earlier Mozart, in this Vienna that was so intensely the center of music in the Western European universe. France had the revolution at that point, so there's a civil war, other countries are more isolated. But there was a real energizing situation to be a composer in Vienna between the end of the 17th into, 18th into the beginning of the 19th century. So generally, when I hear Schubert, I think romantic. When I hear Beethoven, I think classic, but then later becoming romantic. Or creating that path. And but Schubert died. If Schubert had died until, let's say, at least 20, 30 years later than he died, we would have had a different trajectory of his compositions in terms of style. And sometimes the way musicians think of musicians, you know. The striking works, or the ones that we chose to think that they're essential for the instrument, for the music itself, symphony, opera, mass, trio, chamber music, of course. But the solo piano, the evolution of the instrument, Haydn lived longer than most at that time. He died only in 1809, so perhaps that was disturbing too for him, to see how much Beethoven was breaking the rules to create his own. In fact, Beethoven at the get-go was not comfortable with the status quo of the musical language which he received there in Vienna. Though in the early sonatas you cannot but see it on the surface that he's budding, but he stays formal, so to say, polite. And then at some point he just lets all go loose, and in fact he discovers his inner himself in evolution, of course, but breaking with all these rules and the tonality choices and starting sonatas with slow movements, finishing them with fugues. And the usage of the fugue for Beethoven anyway was not but a stylistic example of music that expresses, well, pure music expresses struggle and collisions compared to Bach's flawless contrapoint. The idealization of a society where all parts are equal and all of them live in good harmony with each other. But in Beethoven, he expresses a lot of the struggle of the human kind against the adversities. Mozart, more like the angel dictated him music that is inspirational because uplifting, but not possibly identifiable with our own condition compared to Beethoven. While he was the genius of the geniuses, we still feel that this struggle of creating a whole symphony or a sonata out of 3 repeated notes, saying, I can take something banal and make it transcendental, I think that is something very appealing to the human condition. The utter grace of the spiritually gifted composer like Mozart is difficult to connect to. Of course, we connect to because it enchants our souls. It brings meaning to our lives as musicians to say, oh, unbelievable, unthinkable, but at the same time so, and there's no words, gracious, tender, profound, deep, moving. It talks to us. Bach with his contrapoint, the organ. So few people have the capacity to follow so many voices at the same time throughout like he does. I think that ideally, chronological studies give us a guideline, but we have to accept that most of the composers don't fit in them. At least it then makes me wonder, as I said, what would have been the later years of composing, of composers who died in their youth, even if in their own time period the general expectation of life was length wasn't that longer, with a few exceptions, the Haydn, Brahms, Verdi. Well, it's incredibly already lucky for us that we have access to these treasures and that we try to either serve them by trying to really render the breadth, the structural construction, the drive, the inspiration, purely said, of these composers when we play them or teach them, record them, write articles about them, or edit them in further editions. Basically, as I said, this companionship with pieces that keeps on giving, and that one never gets enough of that thirst for a certain sense of truth, that you search for the right tempo, for the right phrasing, with the right amount of weight in the fingers, and how you're going to express this opening, for instance, of Sonata Opus 101 by Beethoven, which is in A major, starts on the whole first movement of a dominant E major that barely reaches its tonic at the end of the first movement, and some people consider that possibly the F major dotted fast movement rhythms is part of that first movement or a second movement. But regardless how you define the separations, it is in F major, which is creating throughout the first 2 movements or sections a giant tension, because it would be deceptive cadence of the dominant major triad of E major to F major, which would be the 6th flat 6th degree. And so, yes, I can mention these tonality choices, these delay resolutions to the tonic, perhaps like the verb at the end of the syntax in a German sentence. Perhaps not, but perhaps yes. And it doesn't matter. Ultimately, is whatever motivates you to get you to go on the tracks and try to phrase it, to narrate it, to say it as it is, beyond what it means to you, or perhaps you can't avoid putting your own layer of what it means to you and your life's experience. There is something of a dialogue between the notes and the text and the notation with our inner life, even if it's centuries apart for everything else in terms of technology or sense of patience, dissonance, consonances, meaning, need, reason for music. And at the same time, it's intemporal. That's what is so amazingly touching. That's why it's so moving to me when I see students discovering a piece that I've been companionship with for decades, and it's their first 3 months with it. And of course, there were jams sessions, of course, that's for jazz, or exams sessions for students, and auditions and competitions, which come way too early in the deadlines compared to the time it takes to mature the understanding of this composer's thoughts, let less to translate them, not only by playing the right notes, rhythms of the indicated scores signs, but also inhabit them with a meaning, with a conviction that transcends the recitation of the correct, knowledgeable, authentic-oriented interpretation. That's the most important in honesty when we serve the notes of another person, but while we play them, we have to find the meaning for them, for us, through our playing. And so when I see that they discover different paths in the piece that I have not seen in it, or then I find through them fingerings, articulations, or dispositions of the two hands that allow to play it better in the sense of reliable and allowing to organize better the voicings and the structure of the texture. It keeps you humble because you've never reached the moment where you know what it is and how it's supposed to be done. And with each student, it restarts anew. In fact, we're both the student and the teacher, students of the master who wrote the piece. I love listening to testimonies which exist now. You can reach them easily online, where a student of Liszt from the late 1886, last year of his life, when this student was 17, relates to those lessons 70 or so years later on a radio interview. And then I heard also similar testimonies of students of Clara Wieck Schumann. I read Georges Mathias, a student of Chopin from the late years of the 40s in Paris in 1900, in a preface of a work about Chopin's practicing sections of pieces by his own student Isidore Philippe, remembering the lessons with Chopin. And it gives you the illusion for a moment that you are there then. That beyond this intemporal, amazing legacy of music and artistry that a Liszt, Clara Wieck, or let's say Chopin left us with. And all of a sudden you hear the students mentioning it. So perhaps their memory, so many decades later, is not so accurate. I cannot argue that it's possible, but I like to believe that they really remembered. And in this case, the student of Liszt was saying that Liszt asked him to bring the Fugue of 106 for a lesson. And he was thinking, as he says, after all, this is the master who was kissed by Beethoven, which is the case when Liszt was a child prodigy. And Czerny, student, former one of Beethoven, dragged Beethoven to hear that under 10-year-old Liszt's child, I think he was. And Beethoven went on stage to kiss him on the forehead while the audience was applauding. Perhaps in this early 21st century, such reverence is old-fashioned and sounds perhaps a little unnatural in the rapport to admiration for a master or rapport for admiration for an artist. Different times, different ways. But it meant something to them so much in order to bring a testimony of what it meant to have been their student. With little funny anecdotes or some real deep thoughts, but generally shaped by the culture of these great musicians, beyond technique, certain aesthetics of poetry, of historic knowledge of the genre and the examples they were giving and how they were transmitting what was essential to them, to their young students. I find that moving, to be honest, differently than the works of the compositions of theirs that we play, teach, and record and love and cherish and try to serve at best and always feel like we haven't yet reached it, which hopefully will keep us trying. I find that to be the ultimate situation, to see a student play better than you, or at least bring the student to express themselves to their best with your experience of the piece. And I think this is probably the most rewarding.